The autumn morning started like any other for Sarah Jenkins. She rushed into her favorite coffee shop in downtown Atlanta, her scrubs slightly wrinkled from her 12-hour night shift at Grady Memorial Hospital. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as she joined the line, checking her phone to make sure she had enough time before heading home to sleep. That's when she heard it. A warm laugh that somehow stood out among the morning buzz of customers. Sarah looked up from her phone, curious about the source of such genuine joy. Her eyes found a young man in a wheelchair at a corner table, sharing a joke with the elderly barista who was wiping down nearby tables. The man caught her staring and smiled. Sarah quickly looked away, embarrassed at being caught, but couldn't help stealing another glance. He was handsome, with kind brown eyes and a neatly trimmed beard. His wheelchair was sleek and modern, and his business casual attire suggested he worked in a professional setting. "The usual, Sarah?" called out Marco, her regular barista. "Yes, please. Large caramel latte with an extra shot," she responded, fishing for her wallet in her backpack. As she waited for her drink, Sarah noticed the man in the wheelchair struggling slightly to reach for his coffee cup, which the previous customer had accidentally pushed too far back on his table. Without thinking, she walked over. "Would you like some help?" she offered, immediately wondering if she was being offensive. The man looked up at her with those warm eyes and smiled again. "That would be great, actually. Thank you." His voice was deep and pleasant, matching his cheerful demeanor. Sarah moved the cup closer to him, and he nodded appreciatively. "I'm James, by the way. James Miller." "Sarah Jenkins," she replied, noticing the laptop and programming books spread across his table. "Are you a computer person?" James laughed. "That obvious, huh? Yeah, I'm a software engineer at Tech Solutions downtown. What about you? I'm guessing from your scrubs that you're in healthcare." "Nurse at Grady Memorial. Just finished my night shift, actually." Sarah was surprised by how easy it felt to talk to him. "Tough job. You must be exhausted," James said, genuine concern in his voice. "Sarah, your latte's ready," Marco called out. "Well, duty calls. My bed is waiting for me," Sarah said, starting to turn away. "Hey," James called after her, "I'm usually here most mornings around this time, if you ever want to chat when you're less tired." Sarah felt a flutter in her stomach she hadn't experienced in years. "I might take you up on that," she replied with a smile. Over the next few weeks, Sarah found herself looking forward to her post-shift coffee more than ever. James was indeed there most mornings, and their conversations grew longer and more personal. She learned that he'd been in a car accident 5 years ago that left him paralyzed from the waist down. But what struck her most was how he spoke about it, not with bitterness, but with a kind of peaceful acceptance. One morning, after sharing stories about their families, his parents lived in Virginia, hers were local, James hesitated before speaking. "Sarah, I've really enjoyed our morning talks," he said, fidgeting with his coffee cup. "Would you maybe want to grab dinner sometime? When you're not half asleep from work?" Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. She'd been hoping he would ask, but a small voice in her head reminded her of what her mother would say about dating someone with a disability. She quickly pushed that thought aside, remembering all the moments over the past weeks when James had made her laugh, challenged her thinking, and shown her nothing but kindness. "I'd love to," she replied, her smile genuine and warm. As she walked to her car that morning, Sarah couldn't stop smiling. She had no way of knowing that this simple yes would lead to the most extraordinary journey of her life. That by looking past James's wheelchair and seeing the man behind it, she was about to embark on an adventure that would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, ability, and the power of the human spirit. Sometimes, the biggest moments in life start with something as simple as a coffee and a smile. For Sarah Jenkins, that autumn morning was just the beginning. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about her upcoming dinner date with James. As she stood in front of her closet on Friday evening, her phone buzzed. It was her mother, Linda, calling for their daily chat. "Baby, you're usually at home sleeping at this time. What's got you up?" Linda asked, curious about the rustling sounds of clothes she could hear. Sarah took a deep breath. "I'm actually getting ready for a date, Mom." "Oh, that's wonderful. Tell me about him. Is he a doctor from the hospital?" "Well, no." Sarah hesitated. "His name is James. He's a software engineer, and he's really wonderful. But Mom, before you get too excited, I should tell you something. He's in a wheelchair. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. A wheelchair? Linda's voice dropped. Sarah, honey, are you sure about this? Taking care of patients is your job, not your personal life. This sounds complicated. Sarah felt her chest tighten. Mom, he's not a patient. He's a successful professional who happens to use a wheelchair. There's a difference. I'm just thinking about your future, baby. What about children? Family activities? It won't be easy. Sarah ended the call feeling deflated, but she refused to let her mother's words change her mind. She chose a simple blue dress and headed to the restaurant where James had made reservations. When she arrived, James was already there, looking handsome in a crisp button-down shirt. His face lit up when he saw her, washing away any doubts her mother's words had planted. The restaurant staff had seated him at a table that was perfectly accessible, and Sarah noticed how smoothly James maneuvered his wheelchair. As they ordered their meals, she found herself relaxing, caught up in their easy conversation about everything from favorite movies to childhood dreams. So, James said, looking slightly nervous, I'm guessing you told your family about our date? Sarah nodded, playing with her napkin. My mom, she had some concerns. James gave a knowing smile. They always do. My last girlfriend's parents were the same. Actually, she ended things because of the pressure they put on her. I'm not her, Sarah said firmly, reaching across the table to touch his hand. I make my own decisions. Their evening was perfect until they were leaving the restaurant. A group of young men passed by, and one of them loudly whispered, Man, why would someone like her settle for that? Sarah felt James's hand tighten on his wheelchair's armrest. Without hesitation, she turned to face the group. Excuse me? The only person settling would be him settling for small-minded people like you. The men looked embarrassed and hurried away. When Sarah turned back, James was looking at her with a mix of surprise and admiration. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. Yes, I did. Nobody talks about my date that way. On the drive home, James was unusually quiet. When Sarah pulled up to his apartment building, he turned to her. Sarah, I need to be honest. Dating me won't always be easy. There will be more people like those guys, more family members with concerns. Some places won't be accessible. Some activities will be challenging. I understand if that's not what you want to deal with. Sarah thought for a moment before responding. James, everyone has their challenges. What matters is whether the person is worth facing those challenges with. And so far, you seem pretty worth it to me. His smile in response made her heart flutter. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, her phone lit up with a text from James. Thank you for seeing me, not my wheelchair. Tonight was perfect. She smiled as she typed back, It really was. When can I see you again? Before falling asleep, Sarah made a decision. She would not let anyone's prejudices or fears stand in the way of what could be something special. Her mother would either come around or have to accept her choices. As for those strangers at the restaurant, they had only strengthened her resolve to give this relationship a real chance. Sometimes, the strongest foundations are built when facing the first obstacles together. For Sarah and James, these early challenges were just making their connection stronger. 6 months into their relationship, Sarah and James had fallen into a comfortable routine. Their weekly movie nights at James' accessible apartment became something they both looked forward to. This particular evening, they were cuddled on his comfortable couch, Sarah leaning against him while they watched their favorite romantic comedy. You know, James said during a quiet moment in the film, I never thought I'd have this again after my accident. Sarah turned to look at him. Have what? This, someone who looks at me the way you do. Someone who doesn't see the chair first. Their moment was interrupted by Sarah's phone ringing. It was her sister Michelle. Sarah almost ignored it, but Michelle had been the only family member who supported her relationship from the start. Sarah, you need to come over, Michelle said, her voice urgent. Mom's organized a family dinner, and she's invited Marcus. Sarah sat up straight. Marcus was her ex-boyfriend from college, the one her mother had never stopped hoping she'd get back together with. She did what? James noticed the change in her posture. Everything okay? Sarah covered the phone. My mom's trying to set me up with my ex, at a family dinner. Tonight? James's face fell slightly, but he tried to hide it. You should go. Show them you're not interested. Sarah thought for a moment, then spoke into the phone. "Tell Mom I'll be there, and I'm bringing James." When they arrived at her parents' house 2 hours later, Sarah could feel the tension. Her mother's smile became fixed when she saw James wheeling up the ramp they've installed at the back entrance. Marcus was already there, looking uncomfortable. "Sarah, honey." Linda rushed forward to hug her daughter. "And, James, I didn't know you were coming. The dining room might be a bit tight." "It's fine, Mom. We'll make it work." Sarah's voice was firm. The dinner was awkward at first. Linda kept trying to bring up old stories involving Marcus, while Sarah's father sat quietly, observing James. But then James started talking about his work developing accessibility software for children with disabilities, and even Linda couldn't help being impressed by his passion and intelligence. "So you run your own team?" Sarah's father spoke up for the first time. "Yes, sir. We're working on making educational software more accessible for everyone. Actually, Sarah's been helping us test some of our prototypes with her pediatric patients." Sarah smiled, remembering the joy on her young patients' faces when they could finally use computers like their friends. She reached for James's hand under the table. Marcus watched this interaction and stood up. "Mrs. Jenkins, I appreciate the invitation, but I can see Sarah's heart is somewhere else. And honestly, I can see why." He nodded respectfully to James before leaving. After dinner, as they were preparing to leave, Sarah's father pulled her aside. "Baby girl, I need to apologize. I was wrong about James. I see how he looks at you, how he treats you. That's what matters." Sarah hugged her father tightly, tears in her eyes. "Thanks, Dad." Later that night, back at James' apartment, they talked about the evening. "Your dad actually shook my hand when we left," James said, still sounding surprised. "They're starting to see what I've seen all along," Sarah replied, helping him transfer from his wheelchair to the couch. The movement was natural now, part of their daily rhythm. "And what's that?" James asked, pulling her close. "That you're just a man who loves me. The chair is just part of our story, like my terrible cooking or your awful taste in music." James laughed. "Hey, classic rock is not awful." Sarah smiled, but then became serious. "You know, when people stare at us in public, or when my mom makes comments about our future, I used to worry. But now, I just feel sorry for anyone who can't see how perfect we are together." James pulled her closer. "I love you, Sarah Jenkins." It was the first time he'd said those words, though they both felt them for months. "I love you too," she replied without hesitation. That night marked a turning point. The barriers of prejudice and misunderstanding were finally starting to crumble, replaced by the simple truth that love doesn't see limitations, it sees possibilities. For Sarah and James, their love had grown stronger with each obstacle they'd overcome together. 18 months had passed since that first coffee shop meeting, and James had a secret he'd been keeping from Sarah. Every Tuesday and Thursday, when Sarah worked her night shifts, he'd been attending physical therapy sessions. Not because he expected to walk again, his doctors had been clear about that, but because he had a plan. Sarah noticed James had been acting strange lately. He was taking more private phone calls, being mysterious about his schedule, and seemed distracted. A small part of her worried, but she trusted him completely. One sunny Saturday morning, James texted her, "Meet me at our coffee shop, like old times." When Sarah arrived, she was surprised to find the usually busy cafe empty except for Marco, their favorite barista, who was grinning from ear to ear. "Where is everyone?" Sarah asked, confused. "Private event," Marco winked, handing her the usual caramel latte. James wheeled in through the back entrance, looking nervous but handsome in a suit. Sarah hadn't seen him this dressed up since their first date. "What's going on?" she asked, noticing rose petals scattered on the floor. "Do you remember exactly where you were standing when we first met?" James asked, his voice slightly shaky. Sarah pointed to a spot near his usual table. "Right there, you couldn't reach your coffee cup." "Go stand there," he requested softly. As Sarah moved to the spot, gentle music began playing, their favorite song. She turned to find James no longer behind her. When she turned back, she gasped. Using arm braces and with tremendous effort, James was standing. Not walking, but standing, something he'd been practicing for months in secret. In his hand was a small velvet box. "Sarah Jenkins," he began, his voice full of emotion, For 18 months, you've shown me that love has no limitations. You never saw my wheelchair as a barrier. You fought for us when others doubted. You love me completely, exactly as I am." Tears were streaming down Sarah's face as Marco recorded the moment on James's phone. "Every day with you makes me want to be better, to do more, to be more. I've been practicing standing for months, just for this moment, because I wanted to look into your eyes when I asked you this question." James's arms trembled with effort, but his voice was steady. "Will you marry me?" Sarah stepped forward, supporting him gently as she looked into his eyes. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes." As she helped him back into his wheelchair, they were both crying and laughing. Marco brought out champagne he'd been hiding behind the counter, and they celebrated in their special place. Later that evening, at a surprise engagement party James had organized at his apartment, Sarah couldn't stop staring at her ring, a beautiful sapphire surrounded by diamonds. "I can't believe you learned to stand just to propose," she said, still amazed. "I wanted to show you that I'll always try my hardest for you," James replied, "even if it seems impossible." Sarah's parents were there too. Her mother, who had finally come around after seeing their love story unfold, was already talking about wedding plans. Her father had hugged James and officially welcomed him to the family. "You know," Sarah's mother said, pulling her aside, "I was so wrong about James. You saw what we all missed, the strength of his character, the size of his heart." "Thanks, Mom," Sarah replied, watching as James chatted with her father about their plans for the future. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Sarah and James found a quiet moment together on his balcony. "Are you ready for this adventure?" James asked, a hint of his old insecurity showing through. Sarah knelt beside his wheelchair and took his hands in hers. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." The city lights twinkled below them, and the night was full of promise. The journey hadn't been easy, and they knew there would be more challenges ahead. But they had proven that love could overcome any obstacle, break down any barrier, and silence any doubt. The coffee shop where they first met would now hold an even more special place in their hearts, not just as the beginning of their story, but as the place where they decided to write the rest of their chapters together. 3 months into their engagement, Sarah and James sat in their 5th wedding venue of the week. The event coordinator was talking excitedly about their grand staircase entrance, completely oblivious to James's wheelchair beside her. And here's where the groom would make his dramatic entrance. The coordinator trailed off, finally noticing James's raised eyebrow. "Is there a ramp or elevator access?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her patience. "Oh, I'm so sorry. No, we're a historic building. Maybe we can set up a temporary ramp." James squeezed Sarah's hand, seeing her frustration. "Let's check the next place on our list." The next venue was accessible but came with its own challenges. Sarah's cousin Lisa, who was helping with the planning, pulled her aside while James discussed the layout with the venue manager. "Sarah, I need to ask something awkward. For the first dance, how will that work?" Sarah took a deep breath. "We've already figured that out. James and I have been practicing. I'll sit on his lap, and he'll use his wheelchair. It'll be beautiful." "But the photos?" Lisa started. "Will be perfect," Sarah cut her off firmly, "because they'll be real." That evening, at their apartment, they had moved in together a month after getting engaged. Sarah found James looking at wedding dance videos on YouTube. "Maybe we should just skip the first dance," he said quietly. "I don't want to make a spectacle." Sarah closed his laptop. "No way. I've been looking forward to dancing with my husband. We're doing this our way." The next challenge came from the formal wear shops. The first 3 stores didn't have experience fitting suits for someone in a wheelchair. The 4th tried to convince James to wear something more comfortable instead of his dream suit. Finally, they found Marcus, a tailor who specialized in adaptive clothing. He understood exactly how to adjust a classic suit to work perfectly for James's needs. "See?" Sarah said as James admired himself in the mirror. "Perfect." Their families brought their own sets of concerns. Sarah's aunt kept asking about children. "Have you thought about the challenges?" she'd say, not realizing they were within earshot. James's mother worried about the ceremony length. "Can you sit comfortably that long, honey?" she'd ask repeatedly. But for every challenge, they found a solution. When the florist suggested tall centerpieces, they'd opted for low, elegant arrangements so James could see across the tables. When the dance floor at their chosen venue had a small step, the owner immediately offered to build a permanent ramp, saying other couples would benefit too. One afternoon, while addressing invitations, Sarah noticed James looking troubled. "What's wrong?" she asked. I want everything to be perfect for you. Sometimes I feel like I'm making everything harder." Sarah put down her pen and moved to sit on his lap, something that had become as natural as breathing. "Listen to me, James Miller. Nothing about this is hard. You know what's hard? Planning a wedding with someone you don't love completely. That would be hard. This is just logistics." James smiled, but Sarah wasn't finished. "Every solution we find makes our wedding more unique, more us. And maybe we'll help other couples too. That ramp at the venue, that's our legacy." Later that week, they met with their wedding planner, Kelly, who had experience with accessible weddings. She presented them with a detailed plan that anticipated every need while maintaining the elegance they wanted. "I've arranged for all tables to be at the perfect height for James," Kelly explained. "The dance floor is completely level, the aisle is wide enough, and we planned rest areas throughout the venue." For the first time, Sarah and James felt like their wedding was coming together. That evening, during their dance practice in their living room, Sarah rested her head on James's shoulder as they moved to their song. "You know what?" she said softly. "Every challenge we solve just proves we can handle anything together." James kissed her forehead. "I can't wait to marry you." They had learned that while wedding planning with accessibility needs required extra thought, it also made everything more meaningful. Each solution was a testament to their love and determination to create a day that truly represented them, not despite their challenges, but beautifully inclusive of them. The morning of the wedding dawned with perfect autumn weather, just like the day they first met 2 years ago. Sarah stood at her parents' house, looking out the window while her makeup artist worked her magic. She could see guests already arriving at the garden venue next door. Beautiful discovery they'd made that solved all their accessibility needs. In another room nearby, James was getting ready with his groomsmen. His best friend Mike had become an expert at helping him with his suit while keeping the conversation light and normal. "Dude, you're really doing this?" Mike grinned, adjusting James's tie. "Can't believe she said yes," James replied, his hand slightly shaking as he straightened his jacket. "Are you kidding? She looks at you like you hung the moon," Mike said, stepping back to admire his handiwork. Meanwhile, Sarah's mother Linda was helping her into her dress, a beautiful creation that had been designed to look perfect whether she was standing or sitting on James's lap during their dance. "You look radiant, baby," Linda said, tears in her eyes. "I was so wrong about James. You saw what I couldn't see." "Oh, Mom, don't make me cry. The makeup artist will kill us both," Sarah laughed, hugging her mother carefully to avoid wrinkling her dress. Outside, the venue had been transformed. The garden paths were lined with smooth runners for James's wheelchair. The altar was set up under a massive oak tree, with plenty of space for him to position himself perfectly. Every detail had been thought through, but nothing looked clinical or obvious. It was simply beautiful. Sarah's father appeared at the door. "It's time, princess." As the music started, James positioned himself at the altar, his heart pounding. The guests were seated on either side of the wide, smooth aisle, their faces full of joy. Even those who had initially doubted their relationship were there, supporting them fully. Then the music changed, and everyone stood. Sarah appeared at the end of the aisle with her father, and James felt his breath catch. She was stunning in her white dress, but it was her smile that hit him hardest, the same warm, genuine smile she'd given him that first morning at the coffee shop. As she walked toward him, James remembered all the moments that had led to this day, the first date, the first "I love you," the proposal, and every challenge they'd overcome together. Each step she took toward him felt like another victory they'd shared. When she reached him, Sarah's father kissed her cheek and then did something unexpected. He hugged James tightly. There wasn't a dry eye in the garden. The ceremony was perfect in its simplicity. Their vows were personal and honest, acknowledging their unique journey while celebrating their ordinary love. "Sarah," James said, his voice strong and clear, "you saw me when others saw a wheelchair. You fought for us when others doubted. You choose me every day, and I promise to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret that choice." Sarah's vows were equally moving. James, you taught me that love has no limitations. You showed me that challenges are just opportunities to grow stronger together. I promise to always be your partner, your advocate, and your best friend. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Sarah leaned down to kiss James, and their guests erupted in applause and cheers. As they turned to face their friends and family, everyone could see the pure joy radiating from their faces. The path back down the aisle was scattered with rose petals, just like the day James proposed. As they moved together, Sarah's hand resting lightly on James's shoulder, their guests threw lavender and called out blessings. At the end of the aisle, before heading to their reception, they paused for a moment together. "Well, Mrs. Miller," James said softly, "we did it." "Yes, we did, Mr. Miller," Sarah replied, leaning down to kiss him again. "But the best part is about to happen. The reception." Sarah grinned mysteriously. "You'll see." Little did their guests know, but the biggest surprise of the day was yet to come, one that would make their wedding go viral and inspire thousands of others to believe in love without limits. The wedding reception was in full swing. The accessible venue looked magical with its twinkling lights and low floral centerpieces. Sarah and James had just finished their first dance, which had brought tears to everyone's eyes as Sarah sat gracefully on James's lap, moving together in perfect harmony to their favorite song. Now it was time for the cake cutting, a moment James had been secretly preparing for over the past year. Only Mike, his best man, and his physical therapist knew what was about to happen. "Ladies and gentlemen," the DJ announced, "please gather around for the cake cutting ceremony." The three-tiered wedding cake was positioned at a special table that had been carefully set up at the perfect height. Guests gathered around, phones ready to capture the moment. Sarah stood beside James's wheelchair, her hand resting lovingly on his shoulder. "Actually," James said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room, "I'd like to try something different." Sarah looked down at him, confused. Mike quickly stepped forward, positioning himself on one side of James while the physical therapist, who had been disguised as a wedding coordinator, moved to the other side. "James?" Sarah's voice was uncertain. Slowly, with practiced movement, James began to push himself up from his wheelchair. Mike and the therapist stood ready, but didn't assist. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth as she realized what was happening. The room fell completely silent. Using the specially designed leg braces hidden under his suit pants and all the upper body strength he developed over months of secret training, James rose to his feet. It wasn't easy. Beads of sweat appeared on his forehead, but he was standing. Sarah was crying now, understanding all those mysterious appointments and late-night absences. Their guests were frozen in amazement. "I wanted to stand beside my wife," James said, his voice thick with emotion, "just for a moment, to cut our cake together." Sarah stepped closer, wrapping one arm around his waist to support him while trying to contain her tears. "You amazing man," she whispered. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since the day you said yes," James replied, reaching for the cake knife. Together, they cut the first slice of their wedding cake. The photographer captured the moment perfectly. Both of them standing, Sarah in her beautiful white dress, James steady on his feet, their hands joined on the knife, and their faces glowing with love and triumph. The room erupted in applause and cheers. Even the catering staff were wiping away tears. Sarah's mother was sobbing openly into her husband's shoulder, all of her former doubts about their relationship completely forgotten. After cutting the cake, Mike and the therapist helped James back into his wheelchair. Sarah immediately sat on his lap, kissing him deeply, not caring about their audience. "That's why you insisted on the higher cake table," she said, finally understanding. "You planned this all along." "I wanted to give you one standing moment," James replied, wiping away her tears, "even though you never asked for it or needed it." Sarah's father approached them, his eyes wet. "Son," he said to James, his voice breaking, "that was the bravest thing I've ever seen." As the reception continued, guests came up one by one to express their amazement and admiration. But what touched James and Sarah most were the comments about their love, not just the standing moment. "It's not about the standing," Sarah explained to her crying mother. "It's about how far he was willing to go to create a special moment, even though I never needed or asked for it. That's who he is, Mom. That's who I married." Later that evening, as they shared a quiet moment alone, Sarah turned to James. You know, you never had to do that, right? I love you exactly as you are. James smiled, holding her close. I know. That's exactly why I wanted to do it. Because you never asked for more than what I am. A few days later, a guest's video of the moment went viral on social media. But what touched people wasn't just James standing. It was Sarah's reaction, showing that she was amazed not because he stood, but because of the love and dedication the moment represented. Their cake-cutting revelation became more than just a wedding moment. It became a symbol of what true love really means. Accepting someone completely while supporting their dreams, no matter how impossible they might seem. 2 months after their unforgettable wedding, Sarah and James sat in their living room, still amazed by how their story had touched so many lives. Their wedding video had reached millions of views online, inspiring countless messages from people around the world. Listen to this one, Sarah said, reading from her phone. Dear Sarah and James, your love story gave me courage to tell my parents about my boyfriend who has cerebral palsy. They watched your video, and for the first time, they're willing to meet him. James smiled, wheeling over to join her on the couch. Here's another one. I'm a physical therapist, and I show your cake-cutting moment to my patients who think their lives are over after an injury. Thank you for showing that love knows no boundaries. Their viral fame had brought unexpected opportunities. A local news station had interviewed them, and their story had been picked up by national media. But what mattered most to them wasn't the attention, it was the impact they were having on others. Sarah had started a blog about their life together, sharing honest stories about their daily challenges and victories. She wrote about everything from their home adaptations to their travel adventures, showing that a wheelchair didn't limit their ability to live fully. James's software company had gained recognition too, leading to more opportunities to develop accessible technology. He had been invited to speak at conferences about inclusive design, always with Sarah proudly by his side. One Sunday morning, as they enjoyed breakfast on their accessible patio, Sarah shared some news. Remember that little girl at the hospital who's paralyzed from her car accident? The one who was so depressed? Sarah paused, smiling. She asked if you could visit her. She saw our video, and now she's telling everyone she's going to be a software engineer like you. James's eyes lit up. Set it up. I'll bring her one of our prototype learning tablets. Their families had become their biggest supporters. Linda, Sarah's mother, had transformed from her initial skepticism into an advocate for inclusive love. She even started a support group for families adjusting to disabilities, often sharing her own journey of understanding. Mom called, Sarah said, checking another message. She wants us to speak at her next support group meeting. Can you believe this is the same woman who tried to set me up with Marcus at that dinner? They laughed together at the memory, now able to find humor in those early challenges. Their home had become a gathering place for friends, both old and new. They hosted regular dinner parties where everyone felt welcomed and included. Their accessible home design had even inspired some of their friends to make their own homes more inclusive. One evening, during one of these gatherings, Sarah's sister Mitchell raised her glass for a toast. To Sarah and James, she said, who showed us that the only real disability in life is the inability to see beyond our prejudices. You two didn't just fall in love, you taught us all how to love better. As their first year of marriage approached, Sarah and James decided to organize a special event at their old coffee shop. They invited couples who had reached out to them, sharing their own stories of love transcending disabilities. Marco, their favorite barista who had witnessed their love story from the beginning, provided the coffee. The small cafe was packed with people, all sharing stories of hope and resilience. Did you ever imagine, James asked Sarah as they looked around at all the smiling faces, that our morning coffee meetings would lead to all this? Sarah leaned down to kiss him. No, but I knew from that first day that you were going to change my life. I just didn't realize we'd end up changing other lives too. Their story had become more than just a viral moment or an inspiring video. It had grown into a movement, showing the world that love doesn't need to fit a conventional mold to be perfect. As they left the coffee shop that evening, hand in hand, just like always, they knew their journey was far from over. There would be more challenges, more victories, and more opportunities to show the world what true love looks like. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about overcoming disabilities. They're about discovering that love, in its purest form, sees no limitations at all. Sarah and James have proved that one cup of coffee, one challenge, and one triumph at a time